Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first of our spring series of Vancouver Institute lectures. My name is Joost Blom, and I'm the president of the Institute, and it's my first duty to remind you very briefly of how much we value your financial support and to encourage you, if you haven't already taken out a membership in the Vancouver Institute, to encourage you to give that serious consideration and bear in mind how ridiculously low our fees are, as you'll see them in the brochure, and the helpful people at the table outside the lecture hall will be only too happy to arrange for a membership for you, and any membership fee and additional donation, if you are able to make one, is fully tax deductible. Now, at the beginning of the series, it's customary to say a word of appreciation to our program chairman, Mrs. Belle Nemetz. I want to say a special word tonight for two reasons. One is that, as many of you know, Mrs. Nemetz, throughout the fall months, was convalescing from illness, and this severely limited what she was able to do, but notwithstanding those limitations, she was as fully involved as ever in the preparation of the program, in sharing her experience and her advice, and her devotion to the Institute and the contribution that she's made to the Institute and to all our enjoyment over the years has never been more remarkably shown than on this occasion. And the second reason, of course, is just to say that we are thrilled and happy that tonight, for the first time this year, she is able to be with us. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Duncan Kennedy of the Harvard Law School. Professor Kennedy is one of the most talented and talked about law professors in the United States, partly because of what he himself has written and said, and partly because of the seminal influence that he and his colleagues in the critical legal studies movement have had on many law students and legal scholars over the last 10 or dozen years or so. Professor Kennedy actually is a native of Cambridge, Massachusetts. He attended Harvard College for his BA, but then deviated for 3 years to Yale, where he took his LLB in 1970. He then spent a year as clerk to Justice Potter Stewart at the U.S. Supreme Court, and after this year at the pinnacle of the U.S. legal system, he was appointed in 1971 assistant professor at the Harvard Law School and was made professor 5 years later. He has taught at the Harvard Law School since 1971, except for a year as a visiting professor at the New England School of Law in 1984-85. He and several of his colleagues at the Harvard Law School, notably Roberto Unger and Morton Horwitz, became the leaders of what as I mentioned, over the last 10 years or so has become widely known as the critical legal studies movement. This has led to well-publicized and probably over-publicized political infighting at the law school itself, but much more importantly, the critical legal studies movement has put ideas in motion that have set the agenda for much of the academic legal discussion that is now carried on around law schools, not only in the United States, but also very much in Canada and in law reviews on both sides of the border. I'm sure that he will introduce some of the aspects of critical legal studies thinking to you tonight. Let me just say that Professor Kennedy asks some of the questions about law and about legal systems that a few years ago would have been thought of as highly provocative and even indecent to some, and maybe still are considered so in some circles. And he answers these provocative questions in a very trenchant and vigorous way. And just to give you an idea of the kind of questions he asks, just a sampling of the more striking titles from his curriculum vitae of his writings. How the Law School Fails, a Polemic is one. First-year law teaching as political action. Changing the corporate law firm from within. Distributive and paternalist motives in contract and tort law. Legal education and the reproduction of hierarchy, which is also published as a book. And finally, and very strikingly, the responsibility of lawyers for the justice of their causes. Professor Kennedy has been described in many terms over the years, but never as dull. And we are absolutely delighted that he is here tonight and is going to speak to us on radicalism and elite institutions. Professor Kennedy.
You gotta flip it on. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm a little nervous because, well, for obvious reasons, there are such a large number of you, but also because although I do quite a bit of speaking, I almost never have a chance to talk to a mixed audience that includes people from different walks of life and different points of view. In general, I lecture to law students or legal academic occasions. When thinking about what I should talk about, it never occurred to me that I should talk about the critical legal studies movement and the contributions that it's made to legal theory. And the suggestion that I might do so, it would alarm me if I hadn't already decided I was not going to do that. The title of my talk, Radicalism in Elite Institutions, is, however, related to my own experience in the critical legal studies movement. And I just thought I'd very briefly try to give you a sense of why this topic. The topic may at first seem like a contradiction in terms, because the point is not how to stamp out or prevent radicalism in elite institutions. My notion is to talk about why it would be a good thing and how to promote radicalism, and I mean left-wing radicalism in elite institutions. So although it may seem like a contradiction in terms, I'm going to go for that. Really, it will be a sermon nonetheless. Also, it may sound like it's that radicalism in elite institutions corresponds to the famous definition of a nuisance, something that's all right in itself that's in the wrong place, as a pig in a parlor. If that's your initial impulse, that left-wing radicalism in elite institutions is either a contradiction in terms or a nuisance, you may nonetheless find this at least mildly interesting as a moment of the history of the present. Because what I'm going to describe, what I'm going to try to do is to generalize from one limited, intense experience. It's an autobiographical effort, which is the experience of what I think everyone involved would describe as the politicization of Harvard Law School. The notion that what happened was an abstract intellectual or theoretical movement which unfortunately gave rise to infighting at Harvard Law School is a very common one. But I'm going to speak from a different perspective. And again, there's no reason why this would be familiar to you, why you would ever have heard of it, but it is actually a sort of notorious event in American legal academia. The situation at Harvard Law School is now that a faculty that was once known for its homogeneity, the coherence and unity of the views espoused by what seemed like a diverse group of people, is now a faculty that's divided quite consciously into three groups. There are about 60 or 65 members of the faculty. Perhaps 20 of them would describe themselves as part of what is sometimes almost jokingly referred to as the left. There are another 15 who would describe themselves bitterly and with some resentment as having to admit that they suppose they are part of the right after all. And then there's a substantial group of people, maybe 35, who would say, I am a mushy centrist. This is a very unusual situation in legal academia. That is, in the United States, there's probably never been true, except for maybe 2 or 3 years at the Yale Law School in the 1930s, when there has been an elite law school, one of the famous law schools and one of the large law schools, that has found itself in the situation that a group of people who think of themselves as at least left liberals, but probably something more like radicals, composed such a large number of the faculty. But this event might be of no significance at all if the brand of radicalism espoused by this minority, but this significant minority, weren't a brand of radicalism that is particularly upsetting or disturbing in an academic context. I'm talking about my own views, which I recognize to be upsetting and disturbing. That doesn't mean they're wrong just because they're upsetting and disturbing. And in order to, now at this point I think I'm going to break away from the specificity of Harvard Law School and talk about this set of views as they might be applied beyond legal education. But I recognize that when I talk about radicalism in elite institutions, I don't really mean radicalism in all institutions in which people of the upper middle class or the middle and upper middle class work. I mean, by elite institutions, I mean something more restricted than that. And now this is the domain which I hope to address. I think the 3 obvious categories of work to which I will be addressing myself are work in universities, work in large health care systems, whether hospitals or health maintenance organizations, mental hospitals or general hospitals of other kinds. So the universe of health, of the organized delivery of health services, the university system, and then government. People who, the world of skilled or professional government service. Those are the 3 domains in which what I'm about to describe seems to me to conceivably have quite a bit of relevance. It may very well be that it has an equal relevance to business, to the private enterprise sector that delivers goods and services in a commercial way, and also to industry. But I have very little sense of that, and it's part of the methodology here to be hesitant about making statements about how, for example, those domains might respond to radicalism in so much as they are elite places of employment. The kind of radicalism that has always existed in elite institutions in North America is mainly associated with Marxism of one kind or another. And critical legal studies is complexly related to Marxism, and the kind of radicalism I'm describing is complexly related to it, but it's not Marxism. The basic tenets that people who think of themselves as Marxists tend to hold are rejected by the type of radicals that I'm talking about. Let me briefly sketch three ideas of radicalism, of what it might be to be a radical in an elite institution. First idea would be that your radicalism would consist of believing that there should be very fundamental and far-reaching reforms in what the institution does in the outside world. I would call this the input-output model of radicalism in the elite institution. So the idea would be, what would make me a radical at Harvard Law School would be, I would believe that the legal system should be changed very dramatically. And as a law professor, I work to bring about dramatic legal changes. And the radicalism of my position would then be measured by how great the legal changes would be. And I would describe myself as a radical in that sense, and I'm a radical egalitarian democratic socialist kind of a pol, and I would be in favor of changing the laws that govern, say, industry in the United States to create a system of worker ownership, which would be essentially inalienable, and to radically modify the distribution of wealth and income in the country. So one definition of radicalism in an elite institution would be trying to accomplish goals like that through one's input into the system from one's elite institution. And in the medical analogy, it might be that one would believe either in a radical transformation of the content of medicine, homeopathic as opposed to conventional medicine, or in the delivery of health services, say in the United States, a radical equalization of the currently grotesquely maldistributed medical services that are made available to the population. That's not the kind of radicalism in elite institutions I'm going to talk about. In fact, that kind of radicalism has always existed. It's incredibly important. It's a very major part of my own life. But it's very familiar, and it's also unthreatening, I think, basically, to the idea of an elite institution. Elite institutions find it easy to absorb and in fact, often to nurture, sometimes to co-opt, sometimes to buy off, but sometimes to give notoriety, as in my case, to people who espouse ideas about radical social change. A second image, this one is closer to what I'm going to talk about what it would be to be a radical in an elite institution, would be that the radicals would be people who were in favor of a policy of including previously excluded groups into the elite institution itself. The general category under which this form of radicalism goes is affirmative action in American institutions, so that the radicalism would consist of believing that the criteria of selection within the institution, say, to become a doctor, or to become a law professor, or a lawyer, or to become a government civil servant, that the whole mode by which these core are put together has unjustly had the effect of excluding women, of excluding people of racial minorities, and also of class bias. So that in this picture of radicalism in elite institutions, the essential point is to change the distribution of the jobs, and by that mechanism, also the distribution of social power, so that, for example, we proposed at Harvard that Harvard Law School should hire women and minorities who were competent to perform the basic functions of a law teacher at Harvard, the most qualified we could find right up to the moment at which women and minorities constituted a reasonable part of the law school faculty. That was a radical proposal. It was a proposal for affirmative action by disregarding the conventional selection criteria and just going on and hiring all the qualified women and minority applicants that we could find until there were a large number of them on the faculty. It's a kind of euthanasia of the intelligentsia, in which of the white male intelligentsia, in which the idea was simply to hand over a substantial part of the institutional power that comes with owning positions in these places to people who had historically been denied the opportunity to exercise that power. And the two goals were and are distributive justice, in the sense that the criteria deeply believed in as meritocratic, reflecting reason, sound judgment, and social utility, have in fact been reflective neither of reason, nor of good judgment, nor of social utility, and that the world would be a better and fairer place if we simply reallocated those jobs on a collective group basis from the middle-class white men who have held them in the past, so that they would reflect the whole society that is being governed by the elite institutions. Medical institutions govern in this sense just as much as legal institutions or governmental institutions. So that's another meaning. That meaning is closer to what I'm talking about, and of course it's infinitely more threatening. I mean, during my now long middle-aged career as a troublemaker in elite institutions, no one has ever gotten mad at me for anything I've said to the newspapers or anywhere else, or any position paper I've ever written, or any article that I've ever written about the redistribution of wealth in the United States. My colleagues just don't care how cracked I may be on that topic. But the idea that we should just hand over to qualified women and minorities and then have some class policy of trying to promote access to elite institutions for working class people, that makes them very mad, lots of them very mad. But not as mad as what I think I would like now to sort of define as a third mode of radicalism in elite institutions. And this one being the least familiar is also, I don't want to say it's the most important, except that in so much as it has been dramatically neglected, it ought to have more attention paid to it. Before I do that, though, I want to say that I don't mean to say that what I'm about to describe could ever be at the expense of the forms of radicalism that I've just mentioned, the form of radical program to change the social world affected by the institution, whether it be law or medicine or government, or the project of inclusion in which class power would be redistributed. But the third domain might be described as radicalism designed to transform the inner culture, the internal culture of elite institutions. This form of radicalism is directed at, well, it's an infinite long list, but I've chosen 3 things to mention that will give a flavor of what you might call cultural radicalism internal to elite organizations. The first is linked to the program of including excluded groups in elite institutions. It has to do with what happens when, say, a law faculty or a government department, say, it could be a Department of Environmental Affairs, or it could, for that matter, be a law department, or it could be almost any large governmental institution, finds itself, for one reason or another, employing a substantial number of women, or a substantial number of minority officers, or a substantial number of people who come from an educational background that is regarded as a badge of inferior class status in the society. A very familiar phenomenon is, in legal education, is that when you begin to hire a lot of women faculty members and have a lot of women students, there is an initial moment of white male euphoria in which it seems, having gotten over the initial hurdle, that all the most delicious benefits of being a husband are about to be reproduced in the workplace, and that one will now have not only the credit for one's liberal ideas, having dramatically increased the number of women in place, but also that a certain kind of workplace unease will be dissipated by the feminine touch. And what that means, I think, is something like this. It's the idea that right inside the workplace, the relatively competitive, cognitive, tough mode with which especially young men have to deal with each other as they scramble for position inside the elite institution will be softened or cut by the presence of women who will act like nice women. They won't be so competitive. They'll be nurturing, supportive, intuitive, uncompetitive, and they will make life much better for everybody, that is, for the white males who have included them in the institution. That's the upside. The downside is, and the number of men who have that reaction is likely to be quite substantial, but it's not by any means everybody, and also there will be another reaction which is, in a sense, the sort of mirror image reaction, which is, we've let you in to our institution, which is going to remain exactly the same as it was before you got here, and we're going to go on acting exactly the way we acted before you got here, so that however you may choose to act, we are going to ignore it, and we're going to go on doing what we've always done. So, for example, the styles of male humor that were characteristic of all these elite institutions were obviously once all male. The style of male humor that was characteristic of the institution will be aggressively reasserted by some men. They'll make lots of dirty jokes as soon as there's a woman in the room. Usually more dirty jokes than they ever would have made when there were no women on the premises, just to make absolutely sure that the women understand that nothing is going to change. Those two reactions, on the one hand, we will have the benefits of home at the office, and on the other hand, we will be able to go on doing everything, if we can make it perfectly clear, we'll go on doing everything the way it's always been before, generates what you might describe as a culture of institutional sexism in elite institutions as they begin to include people. I'm actually emphasizing, I think I'll make this about the issue of women, but I think a vaguely or loosely parallel analysis could be made with other forms of inclusion. Obviously, the gender dimension is unique because most of the white men in elite institutions have some complex relationship with women outside the office, which is then going to be in many ways the model for what happens when women come to the office. But this culture of institutional sexism goes beyond things like the jokes or the expectation of nurturance and support, though those two things are very important. It also involves the reproduction inside the office of aspects of gender relations that have been already very vigorously attacked by feminists under the slogan that the personal is political. And there's a sense in which my third form of radicalism in elite institutions, this one which has to do with the culture of the institution, is an application of the feminist slogan of the early 70s that the personal is political. That slogan, of course, was addressed not to the workplace, but to the family, to the home. And what it emphasized was that issues that people had for millennia experienced as just a function, or experiences that were just a function of being a man or a woman, a husband or a wife, a male or a female lover, issues that seemed just part of, quote, everyday life and trivial, and things that weren't worthy of concern but also weren't in any sense controversial, were in fact part of the politics of patriarchy. Here are some examples of the way that idea plays out not as the personal is political, but that the elite professional is the political. That is, that the cultural life of professional institutions is political. The advent of women produces often very striking patterns of interruption in staff meetings of the elite institution. These are obviously derived from patterns of interruption that exist in the relations between men and women in general in our societies. A typical sort of statistical way of looking at it would be that in the staff meeting, men interrupt women more often than women interrupt men. But you could then, if you were doing your statistical survey, you would of course have to correct for status in the institution. At first, many women interpret what's going on as a product of the fact that they are newcomers, so that it's natural for them to be interrupted all the time. But then it becomes gradually clear that the pattern of interruption will go on forever, and that whereas a young man would never think of interrupting a senior partner, a relatively junior lawyer will interrupt a more senior woman lawyer, at least try once or twice and see what happens. Now, he may have his head handed to him the first time he tries it and may then not do it again, but the woman lawyer is going to have to hand him his head, probably, or at least possibly, if she wants to prevent it from happening again. But it goes beyond initial interruption. Another very striking pattern is that in elite institutions, a crucial dimension of meetings is talking over interruptions, so that one of the ways in which one establishes one's position in a pecking order is by the frequency with which, having been interrupted, one goes on talking anyway and vanquishes the interrupter. So that, now the same analysis, this is also a dimension which is utterly gendered. You can see, just as women interrupt less often and are interrupted more often, it's less frequent for the woman to talk over the interrupter so that the interrupter is basically caused to retreat and shut up and wait. And so that women talk over less often, and also women interrupters get talked over more often than male interrupters, so that the first 5 times the woman tries to interrupt, she doesn't make it. She ends up being quiet. So that's an example of a pattern of life. Now, obviously, I mean, one could multiply examples of this type. There are dozens and dozens of micro behaviors inside elite institutions by which they are constituted as having a particular kind of structure. This type of radicalism is addressed to that set of micro behaviors, and it involves people in the elite institution banding together to disrupt those patterns. I don't think they can be effectively disrupted by individuals, and radicalism in elite institutions is essentially a collective in accord with the basic radical idea, is a collective kind of notion. In order to prevent the interruption pattern from working, a group, it doesn't have to be everybody, it has to be some group of at least 2 people, but it could be 3 people, 2 or 3 people are plenty to do it, have to in some way signal that the interruption pattern is itself going to be interrupted or disrupted. And there are many ways in which that can be done. None of them, if they work, will be welcome. In other words, it's just a basic premise that there is a deep investment of the people in the elite institution in things like the interruption pattern. It's not just love of patriarchy. It's not just love of one's power position. It's also that the interruption pattern is one of the things that tells us where we are and who we are. We know how to behave within it. And even if one is very sympathetic to the idea that it's not fair that women should be more interrupted than men, the minute an effort is made to bring that about, there is a feeling of deep angst, fear, uncertainty. It seems ridiculous, but in fact the emotion that's at stake is the emotion of fear and insecurity about what will happen next. The whole pecking order, the whole internal structure of an elite institution is thrown into question if the interruption pattern is broken. Because who interrupts who tells us who is where, and if a person who once was allowed to interrupt in a particular context discovers that he can no longer interrupt in that context, he will worry that he will end up as the custodian. That it's a slippery slope, that the slightest crack in the status hierarchy threatens everyone in the status hierarchy with a re-scrambling or a reordering, and you just have no idea what the outcome might be. So that's an example of, so what makes the enterprise radical is that the emotions of fear and insecurity that are released in the group by a challenge to these constitutive micro-behaviors means that there will be a reaction. And the managing of that reaction as a radical in this context is perhaps the highest of all the arts of radicalism in alien institutions. The ability to survive the impulse to kick you out or just give you a bad performance rating or marginalize you even further is just, you have to find a way to avoid having that happen to you, because the idea here is to develop movements within elite institutions that last and grow. And that does sometimes happen, as my own experience suggests, that our group started with very few people and now is very large. We did manage to survive the reaction, though I don't really fully understand why it works better in some places than others. Here's another dimension of radicalism inside in this context. One of the just basic choices in elite institutions is how authority is organized along the dimension of age. Most elite institutions of the type that I've been describing seem to be organized around a pattern, which is a pattern that is very hard to take from the point of view of the radical critique of inequality and alienation in our culture. The pattern is that entry-level professionals are subjected to very intense competitive pressure to make a cut of some kind. And that varies from place to place, but they are exploited in the sense that they are made to work incredibly hard for relatively low rewards. They reach the break point, they go over the top, and then they become members of the, so to speak, full-fledged members of the group. They go through their initiation or probationary period is over. During the probationary period, which is often usually quite long, so anywhere from 3 to 10 years, depending on the elite institution, there is the change in status is very dramatic. But at that point, a new set of very powerful distinctions emerge. And again, this is a very tentative generalization, not based on empirical research, but on gossip. It would be something like this, that the typical elite institution has at its core what you might call a collective dictatorship of people between the ages of 40 and 55. The collective dictatorship is not the whole age cohort, but a subcategory of the age cohort. It might be anywhere from a third to a half, or it might be much smaller. It might be a tenth of the cohort, who are basically understood to have the power. They usually work closely together. They usually consider themselves to be the people with the best judgment within the professional criteria. They're the people with the best legal judgment, or the people with the best medical judgment. But basically, they are a network, a closely knit network. Now, in relationship to this core, there are three other identifiable roles. Aside from the neophyte role, very junior partners don't quite fit in yet. They're about to be sorted out, either into the collective dictatorship or into the role of, now here are the other two roles. Around the collective dictatorship, there are people who are closer or further from the core, but there's a definite possibility of staying on in an elite institution for 30 years without ever getting into the collective dictatorship, and knowing quite early that you will always be at least somewhat marginal. Marginal doesn't mean these institutions are professional and they have clients, students, patients. And it's possible to live a wonderful life without ever being in the collective dictatorship, a life that's based on the service dimension of the elite activity. So it's not like being shut out of the collective dictatorship is a sentence of death at all. It's just that it means that you will never be one of the people who count in the institution's power structure. Above, older than the collective dictatorship, there is often a set of people who might be called barons. Barons are sometimes people who were once part of the collective dictatorship. That you can get to be a baron in a number of ways. You could once be part of the collective dictatorship and then cede control to younger collective dictators. Or you might have used your marginal position in the early stages to build an outside base that would then allow you in between the ages of, say, 45 and 70 to be not just a person who serves the clientele well, but a person who has an independent source of funds, a little domain or an empire that the collective dictatorship has agreed never to touch. The collective dictators have no power to disestablish the barons or to modify the power structure defined by the barons. And then in that generation, there will be the people who are neither retired collective dictators who are advising the young nor barons, but the marginal group. And the marginal group is likely to be just as large or larger at this stage. Once again, it doesn't mean being miserable. It just means that you're not a baron, you've never been a collective dictator. Then it's often the case that on top, yet higher up, there will be a patriarch or two. And very few, small number of people who have been elected by the group as older symbols of all that is most deeply revered in the institution. All the other people of that age have disappeared. They've simply ceased to exist in the minds of the rest of the group. So that the structure is quite complex, but it does imply at each level the possibility of being rewarded or rendered invisible. So that on the one hand, it's a hierarchy. It's a hierarchy in which power flows downward from older to younger people. But it's not a simple hierarchy, because the collective dictatorship, for example, is more powerful than a marginal older person, and much more powerful than a marginal person in his or her 70s who is no longer functioning actively in the institutional setting, though maybe living there in a very basic way. So that the power structure is hierarchical according to age, but complexly so. And also within each generation, there's a hierarchy. Within each generation, there's a hierarchy of the more or less successful members of the generation. It's not like there are 20 classes and all the barons may be roughly equal, or there might be a hierarchy of barons too, but however it works out, it's very complicated and very, very usually immovably just there the way it is, understood to be unchangeable, something that just happens to each person in their life of the institution without their being able to control it or change it, and often it's experienced as just rottenly, stinkingly unfair by an amazingly large number of all the people in the institution. The total number of people who would endorse the outcome is likely to be very small. Even in very prestigious institutions. I mean, the Harvard Law School is a very prestigious institution, which many people would fight and die and kill to become a part of. But if you take the faculty as a whole in 1960 or 1970 or 1980, and you looked at how these law teachers felt about themselves in the institution, it was just endlessly the case that the number of people who felt ill-treated, marginalized, disrespected, not adequately loved, recognized, and accepted was never less than 65 or 75%. So, I would argue that that is the general fate of people operating in these elite institutions. Not an uncommon, but a very common thing. Now, here's a third, so there, the program of radicalism in elite institutions could basically be described as being against the government. The government is this structure. So being against the government means, first of all, leveling in the generational sense, that is, fighting the exploitation of the entry-level people during their 3 to 10 years of probation, in which they're expected, either to work 75 hours a week and basically comb the hair and brush the teeth of their bosses endlessly. And that involves more than just the allocation of work. It involves the allocation of deference and power inside the institution, as well as the number of hours worked. It often involves an alliance against the barons with the people the barons have marginalized and whose feelings they've hurt year after year after year, around the notion that in the governance of the elite institution, when there is a meeting, which is, and these institutions often have highly democratic formal constitutions. Very often they do. There will be a meeting in which, in principle, each person who has passed the cut to membership, the initial probationary thing, has an equal vote, but in which for 50 years the votes have been totally predictable. If the collective dictatorship had made up its mind and gotten 2 of the 5 barons to agree, you knew that there would be no meaningful discussion except whining and howling by neurotic marginal people with no other motive than to be there in the situation and make a witness to their own feelings of alienation, and no effective possibility of ever changing the outcome. So that these marginal whiners, these neurotic, experienced often as quite crazy malcontents, confirm for everyone that there is democracy and openness, and we sit there and shuffle our papers while Joe goes on and on and on and on. And therefore, how can anyone say that we don't have an open and participatory and democratic process? Joe is doing everyone an enormous favor, but Joe has never gotten a decision reversed ever in his whole life history of doing this. So the idea is, the stunning idea that in one of these meetings, quite suddenly, unexpectedly, there will be a big vote against something proposed by the collective dictatorship and endorsed by 2 of the 5 barons. The vote should ideally come from nowhere, because among other things, the collective dictatorship and the barons never talk to the marginal people who will be willing to vote against the proposal. And so the idea is that on one of these issues, ideally concerning now the input of the organization into the outside world, that is, questions like what the organization what a law school might do to deliver services to poor people in large quantities, services that the organized bar refuses to deliver, there will be an establishment consensus within the institution about the appropriate limits of charity. A radical proposal would be to go far beyond the appropriate reasonable limit of elite charity and actually try to do something that would have an impact on the world. The alliance then would consist also of the excluded people who have been included in the institution but are invisible, the token minority presence. The token minority faculty member who has been there for years and knows that there will never be another minority presence unless he should take terribly sick, in which case suddenly a recruitment process would produce another one of him unless he were to recover at the last minute. So that's a second dimension of this form of radicalism. A third dimension, the third dimension might be described as, this is the ineffable dimension. The underlying notion of this kind of radicalism is that it is not, actually, because it's ineffable, I'm going to do the classic thing that one does with the ineffable, which is to define it by saying things that it's not. And having said 3 things that it's not, maybe it will be, I will at least have suggested what it is. This is not the model in which you can answer the question, which I'm often asked, well, how is any of this going to change the legal system? Well, it's not going to change the legal system, probably. It might not. It isn't the input-output model of radicalism. The model, it's this model. The idea is that elite institutions are a part of the total social complex, not just because they make inputs into other systems. They are some of the cells in the social totality seen as composed of a multiplicity of cells. Radicalizing one of the corporate cells is something one does for its own sake, as well as for its potential impact outside the cell. So this idea is that if you feel like a radical, you shouldn't not be a radical because you've got a cushy job. A very basic idea in North America is that people who have good jobs have no right to radical opinions. If you're going to take the money, you should damn well shut up. So a basic idea here is to take the money and not shut up. Again, defining it by negation, the idea here is not that these institutions have good ideals and they just don't quite live up to them, so that what we need to do is to get the people in power organized to put pressure on people with power in the institution so that they will change its practices to correspond to the good ideals. That's not the idea, because that idea presupposes a degree of legitimacy both for the ideals and for the existing structure that this form of radicalism denies to them. So that if all that happens is that the managing partners graciously accede to 2/3 of your demands, and you then go quietly back to work, tugging the forelock, and once again observing the rule that it is just as bad to treat your secretary like an equal as a boss like an equal, and that you will be a good hierarchical player once again, then nothing has happened. It's not a reform model. The reform model says everything can go back to the way we usually feel about things once we take care of these grievances. This idea is not that, but rather the idea that the structure of power itself should be transformed so that there would be less of it organized hierarchically. That is, that there would be, and the idea of participatory democracy is the ultimate ideal, which is inconsistent even with the most democratic of these institutions with the way they're run. That is that everybody should have more say at every level, and each level should have more say if it's lower vis-a-vis each of the ones that's higher. So that, and that argument, by the way, then applies across the institution. It's not just a critique of the entry level's relations to the partners, but also of the secretary's relationships to the partners, of the paralegals in the law firm relationship to the partners and the lawyers in the law firm, and so forth. So it's not, it wouldn't be done if it were granted from above, unless the power to grant were in the process challenged and dissolved, so that initiative and creativity were relocated and diffused from where they were before within the elite institution. A third way to define it negatively is that the model is not the model of the organizer with the passive group that has to be made to act in its own interest. That model runs very deep through radical thought, but also through liberal democratic thought, that the group is inherently passive. There are political change agents. There's a particular kind of role, which is the role of the political organizer. Political organizers have skills that are not shared by other people. The most basic of all political organizer experiences is that you can do things that the people you're organizing can't do. You help them do those things, and then they do them, and that's that, and then you go on and help someone else do something they couldn't do. The model is that the organizer's role is to precipitate action from the group. But the idea of this form of radicalism is that if the organizer's experience is that the organizer has simply exercised his or her skills for the benefit of the group, the whole thing is a failure, because that would just be to reinstitute the model of social relations in the elite institution that we are attacking. So in this model, everyone has to learn to be an organizer, and the organizer who over and over has the narcissistic glow of having gotten the ducks in a row has lost. There has to be some more chaotic or anarchistic understanding of the energies of organization than the traditional relationship of the organizer to the audience, or for that matter, of the radical law professor speaking to the Vancouver Institute. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening to me.
Could I ask you to repeat the questions when they're asked into
Okay.
the microphone? Otherwise,
Okay.
people in the back. Questions, please.
Way up there.
The dimension I was going to ask you to comment on is what I would call the ruthlessness of the reaction of the elite institution. There's a continuum in many parts of the world. Radical elite institutions have death squads knocking on their doors. They don't go very far. In this place, British Columbia, it's not that dramatic, but yet, like at this university, the board of governors can meet in camera, not discuss the meeting, how they came to the decision. They, at the Simon Fraser University, summarily fired 7 faculty a few years ago with no justified academic or institutional reason. They just didn't like the politics, right? So it seems to me one of the biggest problems to any progress along the direction that you're talking about is one, how ruthless is the elite institution going to be, and what can you do in different contexts depending on that?
Do you think I need to repeat that, or could you hear it? I'd be happy to repeat the gist of the question if you couldn't hear it. I'll try to paraphrase. The question was, what do you have to say about this dimension, the dimension of reaction against attempts to organize in elite institutions by the powers within the institutions? Those can vary depending on the country, from very extreme reactions like death squads, which in Argentina were directed against middle and upper middle class radicals who were potential members of the Argentinian elite, not only against them, but by any means only against them, but were directed against them nonetheless, to British Columbia, which is obviously a very different matter, far less serious sanctions, but where it is nonetheless true that the university board of governors can meet in camera, there is no publicity control on its proceedings, and where at Simon Fraser University, 7 professors were fired some years ago for no other reason than that someone didn't like their politics. Well, I guess my response to that is that I basically think that it depends on the situation, just as you suggest, and that if there is ever to be a theory of radicalism in elite institutions, the theory would have to include a substantial body of thinking about the circumstances in which the reaction will be very severe or life-threatening or job-threatening, and when it is likely to be less severe. I guess I'd start out sort of thinking about this, looking at it from the point of view of the actor, a person who sets out to be a radical in an elite institution. That there are 2 dangers that arise from the reality of harsh reactions. One danger is to achieve safety through eccentricity. That is, by to be a radical, but to manage somehow to be a radical who has never been able to get a student to attend your radical class. And that's something that people do. The fear, there's an unconscious, I think a deep unconscious sense that if your radicalism is of that brand of effectiveness that will cause, if you're a teacher, 100 students to attend the class, you'll be in trouble. So if you want to have both your radicalism and your job, you better be a bad teacher. If you want to be both a radical and keep your job, in the faculty meeting, you better be a person who causes everyone to shuffle their papers when you talk, and you'll then be able to say, it's because of the deep truth and insight of my beliefs that these awful people have ostracized me, when in fact it's because you are boring, incoherent, and half on purpose have managed to be ineffective. So there's that danger in response. So you'll never know, because it's an experimental matter, it requires a certain kind of Zen inner adjustment to the impact of fear on activity in yourself. Another kind of danger is the belief that people tend always to overestimate the severity of the reaction, and then when a reaction happens, of any type, it tends to confirm for everyone that everything was hopeless all along. So I'm in favor of fighting back against the reactions often to test how serious they are. For example, there's at the New England School of Law in Boston, an institution which I have some experience of, they recently fired 4 professors. I believe the professors were fired for no other reason than their association with one form or another of institutional radicalism, not outside radicalism. They wouldn't have been fired for that. It was that they were changing the institution from within. They complained to the American Bar Association. This is a context in which it's possible to fight the reaction by appealing out beyond the people with their initial reaction, and maybe the American Bar Association will do something about it, though it probably won't. At least the reaction against the reaction, by embarrassing the institution, by complaining and getting a proceeding going, does some good. Now, having said all that, I think that I think, it's hard to speak about this, but I think sometimes it's good to reflect in oneself about it. I think if I had lived in Argentina, I would have left. And I don't think I would have been ashamed of leaving. And I think, in fact, I'm not the kind of person who tends to take up the gun and go underground and become a guerrilla, which obviously was a thing I wouldn't think was unjustified under the circumstances of repression that existed. I don't think it would have been unjustified to see the terror as something that you could fight back against with violence. But I don't think I would have done it. I think it's very important to run, escape, go somewhere else when you believe that you have realistically assessed the likelihood of repression as such that you won't be able to survive in the context. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. Sorry, but...
Given your thesis, there has been a significant increase in the number of women who have been entering the professions of law, medicine,
and government.
Pharmacy, and indeed government. Now, given that what you have been talking about is essentially where it takes place within an individualistic type of society, with a heavy emphasis on individualism, given this change in the character of the people who are attending the school, particularly more women coming to it, given your thesis, do you think there's going to be any significant change in the models that you have spelled out?
If I could, shall I summarize the question, would be, given that there has in fact been a substantial increase in the number of women in these elite institutions and of women students in the schools that prepare for them and so forth, do I think that it's likely that there will be significant change in the institutional arrangements and structures that I described? I honestly think that that is a question that depends on the well, it depends on a million things. I don't think there's an answer to it. I don't know. Maybe there'll be a lot of change, maybe there won't. Maybe there'll be a lot of change in some places, but not in other places. It seems to me unlikely that all over North America there will be a coherent pattern of transformation brought about, for example, by the entry of large numbers of women into elite organizations. I guess my own feeling about it is that you can identify, as you travel around, enormously different institutional tones in law schools. Taking them as one type of elite institution, they vary from extraordinarily culturally shut down. I mean, they're doing nothing as an input, a progressive input into the society. They are highly exclusive, and the few outsiders who are allowed in are really often forced to assimilate utterly and completely and just be as much as possible like the men, and then they're only there on sufferance. On the other hand, there are elite institutions with which I've become familiar, in which outsiders have become insiders and have changed the tone and the quality of life quite a bit. A lot of it depends on whether there is some kind of radicalism in elite institutions in the context. So I don't think there's a general rule. I think it depends on the quality of activism. Let's see. Yeah.
There was at one time a movement for short, fixed terms for these various power positions in these sort of institutions. That sort of disappeared over the last 10 years or so. If that had kept up, do you think it would have done anything besides just increase the number of barons?
As a matter of fact, I don't think it would have done anything besides increase the number of barons. I think that general formulae of governance are significant for the kinds of things that I've been talking about only in particular battles. In other words, if there's, to take another example, in my own institution, the president of the university has the power to appoint the dean of Harvard Law School and has traditionally exercised that power with no formal consultation mechanisms with the faculty. The president has typically informally consulted the power structure of the faculty, and on that basis chosen someone and just announced it. Now, a proposal that all over legal academia, everywhere, all law school deans ought to be elected by the faculty would be meaningless in terms of the structures I've been describing, because the election would be dominated by the power structure. But in the context of a left-wing challenge to the power structure of Harvard Law School, formal faculty consultation about who the dean would be was a very significant demand with a lot of political spin to it. That was a big rallying cry, and it really made a difference to demand that, and it would make an enormous difference to get it once it's the product of a particular battle for influence. So, in other words, for me, one of the basic distinctions between the kind of radical politics that I'm talking about and traditional liberal politics is that in the kind of radical politics that I'm talking about, the energy of the struggle, of the project, comes before the institutional proposals. And it's never all right because we have good rules of governance in effect. It's only all right if there is some relatively continuous mobilization of the people in the elite institution to govern themselves. And they can do that against very bad governance structures and fail to do it even with very good governance structures. I'm going to call on someone way in the back, if I can.
Yes, is the goal of the radicalization or democratization of an elite institution such as the Harvard Law School to, in effect, erase the elite quality of that institution vis-a-vis, say, other law schools?
Other law schools. Is the goal of a project of radicalization, say, of an institution like Harvard Law School, to erase its elite quality vis-a-vis other institutions? A basic question that gets, in an elite institution, one of the first things that's said at the beginning of the reaction is, if you keep this up, we'll fall in the standings. And that's said with total sincerity. And in fact, alumni of elite educational institutions will often intervene when the institution is politicized because they believe that there will be a devaluation of their professional credentials if this is allowed to continue. Well, it seems to me that there are two sort of ways in which this goes. Sometimes, first of all, predictions about the impact of radical activity on the status of the institution and on the internal quality of what it does are extremely uncertain. Radicals are sometimes totally mediocre doctors or scholars. Sometimes they're great doctors or scholars. You can't sort of infer from, and if very powerful, influential radicals who are just no good at what they're supposed to be doing can disrupt and harm the actual quality of the services delivered by the institution. Or they might dramatically improve the actual quality of the services delivered by the institution. Being a radical is no guarantee of professional competence or even of good faith, after all. So what happens depends. But in the sort of utopian model of good radicalism, in any of the kinds of institutions that I've been describing, there is an underlying ethos of liberal professionalism, which I totally subscribe to, and in which a fundamental value is that people should experience the controversialness of social construction. That it is controversial and it is something that's a question of your values that you have to choose how you're going to be a lawyer, for example. And the emergence of disagreement or even polarization in the institution is in that sense to advance its quality as a liberal educational institution. Now then the question becomes, well, what about the practical question? Isn't everyone going to stop going to Harvard and start going to Columbia? And how could that be good, seeing that they're even worse than we are? That kind of question is then asked with complete and total earnestness. I actually react to it on several levels. First of all, it's part of my idea of what these professions should do, that they should radically equalize the institutions involved. So that the idea that there is this enormous discontinuity in the quality of the hospitals that serve different class and ethnic communities in the greater Boston area seems to me to be a shocking and outrageous idea. There is class medicine in the United States and ethnic medicine. So in so much as it's part of the project to level the hierarchies, I don't see the fears as justified. And I myself am in favor of aggressive leveling. By that I mean providing the same quality of services to everybody. It's fine with me if we do that by leveling everybody up. But I would be willing to redistribute resources within the hierarchy if the elites are unwilling to provide enough resources to level up. In other words, if you take fancy law firms, it seems to me, ought not to exist if poor people can't get lawyers. I'm happy for fancy law firms to exist if they will pay for poor people to have lawyers. But it doesn't bother me to say it would be better than the current situation to simply take the legal services provided to the elite by the fancy law firms and redistribute them to the people who really need the services. So in that sense, I'm sympathetic to the idea of an attack or an erosion of the whole hierarchical system. Now, then, a sort of third point is that, as a matter of fact, it doesn't seem to be the case that in the situation I've been involved with in legal education, it seems to be the case that these controversies increase the prestige of the institution. People say, oh my God, I wouldn't want to be on that faculty, it's absolutely horrible, don't send your children there, but alumni contributions and applications go up every year.
What about Argentina?
Let's see. Yeah.
Biologists tell us that hierarchical structures or pecking orders exist in, may I say, lower life forms, assuming that we are higher life forms. I'm sure you have critique on that. In that case, these structures that you describe in organizations are biologically determined. If you ever would put together an equalitarian society, it wouldn't take long for another hierarchical structure to arise. As happened, for instance, in Russia.
If it is true, biologists seem to tell us that in, quote, lower, unquote, forms of life, hierarchical structures are there. They may be just a biological function of human existence as well as of other forms of animal existence. If that is true, any attempt to create an egalitarian society will quickly degenerate into another hierarchical one, as happened in Russia and many other places. Is that a fair summary? Well, first of all, we know from our own society that there are dramatic differences in the degree of egalitarianism or hierarchy that exist in different organizational forms. So the question is not whether human nature, as we have actually experienced it in our lives, can be replaced by something completely different. I'm talking about questions of degree. Radicalism in elite organizations, from my point of view, gets its character not from the radical character of the solution that it proposes, because you may notice that I have no general program. My general program is to kick, scream, bite, and scratch vis-a-vis the existing structure, pushing it in a direction of less structure and less hierarchy. Human nature is just it's a red herring as far as I'm concerned. I mean, people have behaved as I'm behaving throughout history, and that's obviously part of human nature too. The battle against these hierarchies is just as much biologically determined as the impulse or the pattern of their creation. So seeing that we've actually got here and there institutions, I mean, you can just rank them in order. For example, Harvard Law School is far more democratic than Harvard Medical School. If I were at Harvard Medical School, I would argue that we should make Harvard Medical School more like Harvard Law School. Human nature has nothing to do with it. So it's not a question of whether there can be such a thing as, quote, an egalitarian society. It's not right that the choice is between a hierarchical society and an egalitarian society. That supposes, for example, I don't think it's even imaginable to have total equality. I think the word equality is only a directional signal. It's a compass, not a map, meaning that you can use the idea of equality to orient yourself so you know which way to go and which way to push. But it's not a chart of a new society which tells you how much everybody should be paid, namely $15 an hour. The idea of equality functions for this kind of radicalism as a source of energy. It's an ideal, but it's not an in-state ideal. It's not an ideological plan. I think also it's worth saying just a word about the Russian example. I don't think it really is an accurate interpretation of the history of Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution to say that they tried to or did establish an egalitarian society and hierarchy inevitably reasserted itself because that's human nature. I mean, my own picture of that obviously deeply tragic, awful history is that things like good and evil and willingness to murder and commitment to democracy within the Bolshevik group were more significant than human nature. And I don't think Stalin is to be explained by, quote, human nature. Not that he was inhuman or that he was outside the bounds of human nature. But I think it's been something that sort of impoverished our political discourse to talk about this as though you're either for total equality or the status quo, and we all know that total equality doesn't work because just look at Russia. I just don't see that as advancing the ball very far. Dare I comment on the fact that although half the audience is women, no woman has yet raised her hand? You're called on.
I'm a marginal, less successful by your analysis, but I would think that I would be more persuaded by your arguments if I could believe in the sincerity of your motivation, obvious pleasure in friends without established authority. And I'm sorry, I'm nervous.
I'm not sure if I can give a non-facile, non-glib answer to that question. Either yes or no would not seem to qualify. I think it is true of me that I like what I do quite a bit. And, oh, I'm sorry. So let me try to paraphrase the question. I am a person who is not that successful in the terms in which you described, and therefore maybe I ought to be very sympathetic to what you've said. It's not so much that I disagree with the content of it, but that there's something about your tone, your obvious pleasure in attacking the status quo, and the facileness and glibness of it that makes me doubt your sincerity. Have I misunderstood you? I apologize for my tone if it's unconvincing. I actually am willing to. I think it almost always happens that for me, it's a frequent experience that my motives or my good faith are questioned in this kind of discussion, which again is for me mainly a discussion in the law school context, and it's typically students who question it, who say, you guys aren't serious. You're getting off on it too much, and you obviously get too much pleasure out of playing the role of the radical. I'm really willing to let you stay on your side and I'll stay on my side of that. I mean, I'm willing to sort of put it in terms of the quality of the argument. And I really would suggest that you just take what of it seems to be of use to you and don't concede me any authority or distrust me one way or the other. Just treat me as someone who's talking. And you know, if I sound unconvincing, forget it. One or two more questions? Yeah.
Would you be willing to change roles in this audience in terms of having her go down there and yourself imagining yourself being the person listening to her and ask her a question from that position? Switch roles with this woman and you go up there and have her come down here.
I'll give you my honest reaction to that. I'm not sure enough of this context to dare do that. That is, I'm not sure how the audience would react, where it would fit into the context.
Well, okay, so they've answered it.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you were going to think it would be ideal to somehow equalize things. And you used the term real needs. And I'm wondering what sort of process one would use, or who would use it, to identify a real need?
I'm sorry. You've talked about plans to equalize things, and you've used the phrase real needs. And I'm wondering what kind of process you would propose to decide what the real needs are that are going to get the equal treatment, obviously. Because not all needs in any, equalization doesn't mean everybody gets everything. Well, I guess to begin with, the way I thought about that in terms of legal education is conservative. That is, a conservative approach to the needs issue would be to say, there's no reason why, if there are 5,000 law students in the Boston area, I choose a small geographical area on purpose. They're all within a small geographical area with an existing public transportation system and a road network, which makes it possible to move easily among the 5 existing law schools. It seems to me that it's difficult to mount a justification for the fact that the educational resources measured in dollars and degrees that are devoted to the 5,000 students are dramatically different. In other words, the 5,000 students get just dramatically different educations in terms of the resources, the social resources that are devoted to that. So an initial proposal would be just to equalize the educational resources of the 5 institutions in the area. That's the way I would proceed, rather than by starting out with a definition of real need and then reorganizing society to correspond to it. Here's an existing institutional structure. Or take the hospitals in the 5 working class towns that form a ring around the north and west, sort of the northwest segment of the Boston area. There are 5 town hospitals. The towns have low income populations compared to the outer ring of suburbs and the other side of the metropolitan area. They have high tax rates on a low tax base, and their hospitals, including their private hospitals, are, everyone acknowledges, dramatically less good than the hospitals that serve the richer suburban towns. So an initial idea would be, that's bad. So real need would not be defined in any very sophisticated philosophical way. And again, I'm not an in-state radical thinker. What I really believe makes one a radical is not that one has a plan or an analysis that go to the root and are utterly transformative. What I think makes one a radical is that one is willing to do more right now to shake up, disrupt the way things are, to get some identifiable benefit for people who have been deprived or oppressed or shut out or alienated. So when I'm always asked this question about what my big philosophy is, with a strong suggestion that in our society, because we have pluralism, no dictator gets to decide what real need is. And it would make me a little nervous, it often seems to be implied, if someone like you were to go around determining what real need is. Why, compared to our current pluralist democratic way of determining needs, the whole society might be in bad shape. And look what happened to Russia. Now, from my point of view, that's just, again, it's just a complete red herring. You didn't say that. I'm putting words in your mouth. I don't think the question is what dictator will determine what real need is. The question is how much time, money, professional risk, how much energy and excitement is one willing to put into shaking up the maldistribution of hospital resources in a given metropolitan area. I guess we're to one more. Go ahead. He's had his hand up the whole time. Yeah.
The history of the 20th century is full of many depressing examples of learned imbeciles serving the quite vile purposes of dictators, revolutions, cultural upheavals, entrenched power structures, and so on. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how the thought and behavior of intellectuals can be modified in our times so that they are more a vanguard of civilization rather than apologists for barbarism.
Okay, no, I keep forgetting that I have to summarize the question. The history of the 20th century is full of examples of learned imbeciles who have served as apologists for mass murder, social revolutions, cultural revolutions, and other atrocities. Do you have any thoughts about how intellectuals might play a less destructive role? I guess, first of all, I think that we learned imbeciles tend to exaggerate our role in many of those atrocities. That is, I think it's been part of the self-critique of the Western intelligentsia since World War II, typified by Camus, in fact, to attribute a lot of Hitler and Stalin, not to speak of Pol Pot, to learned imbecility. And I guess in that spectrum of views, I'm more towards the mainly what we've done is chirp idly in our bird cages while the slaughter went on below. So I don't start with the view that that's the first question. And I guess I'd say that at the moment, it seems to me that the intelligentsia in the United States is characterized overwhelmingly by a passivity that can't be interpreted as a wise, chastened reflection on its own historic errors. And indeed, that a little more sense of the inevitability of contributing either positively or negatively would be good, rather than, so less futility, less sense of futility would be good. But I don't think there is any formula by which groups, professional corps, can restrain themselves. I sort of like the idea, someone said last night, that engineers, maybe in British Columbia, but maybe in Canada, wear a ring on their little finger, which is symbolic of an engineering mistake causing the collapse of a bridge or a dam and killing lots of people. I think it's only on that level that you can protect yourself, that is by trying to arm ourselves with talismans which remind us of the fact that we might be murderers. That's...
Before I ask Mr. Dick Vogel to thank Professor Kennedy, I just want to add a word to what I said at the beginning, at the commencement of this season. I just want to say a word of thanks to Professor Peter Nemetz, who has been the most tremendous help to Mrs. Bell Nemetz, his mother, and to all of us at the Vancouver Institute in helping to organize this spring series. He has taken on the task and given of his time unstintingly, and no chore was too unpleasant or too small to be done by him with very good grace, and I just want to, on behalf of all of us, thank him very much for all he's done. Let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that the speaker next week will be Mr. Peter Calamai, the Washington Bureau Chief of Southam, and he will be speaking on illiteracy, naming the guilty party. And now I'll ask Mr. Dick Vogel, a past president of the Vancouver Institute, to thank Duncan Kennedy for us.
Thank you, Joost. Professor Kennedy, I belong to a fancy law firm. And in rising to have the temerity to rise and thank you for this evening, I've positioned myself as a peripheral or a marginalized baron by reason of my age. But I nevertheless take you seriously and believe in your sincerity, as I'm sure all of us do. If this is in truth one of the few times you've spoken to a wider audience, let me encourage you to think of Professor Peter, who invented the Peter Principle. He taught in this area. We're familiar with the success that he had with his ideas, radical though they might have been for the time, and yet tame in retrospect. Perhaps the Kennedy Commandments or something of that order might make you more attractive and wider known to a wider audience, and your ideas perhaps live beyond you. Thank you very much for all of us.